This deep dive begins not with a whisper, but with the really determined voice of a woman who, well, she shaped the history of an entire continent. Just listen to the power in this.
La mujer debe afirmar su acción. La mujer, resorte moral de un hogar, debe ocupar su quicio en el complejo engranaje social de un pueblo. The woman must affirm her action. The woman, the moral spring of a home, must take her place in the complex social machinery of a people.
She is fighting for the one thing of greatest value in our consciousness, the will to choose.
That was Eva Peron, September 1947, a really pivotal moment. She was celebrating the approval of civic rights for women in Argentina.
And that single declaration, it was a signal to the whole continent.
Absolutely. And that's our mission today, right? To track the origins and the winding path of female suffrage, the voto femenino, across Latin America.
And what a winding path it is. We're diving into a history of these incredible pioneering acts, some brilliant legal maneuvering, and also this deep-seated resistance that just kept putting up barriers.
Well, the first thing that really stands out is that we have to challenge this common idea of Latin America as, politically behind the West.
Right.
The sources show that several Latin American nations actually recognized female suffrage way ahead of major European powers.
That's such a powerful point. We tend to anchor suffrage history to the UK or the US, but France, for example, didn't grant the vote until 1944.
Exactly. And in Latin America, we're looking at this process that spans, roughly 3 decades, from the late 1920s to the early 1960s. And it was just full of these legal and social contradictions.
So it wasn't a straight line at all. It was more like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Precisely. The story is full of these partial victories and laws that were designed to look like they were granting a right, but were actually restricting who could use it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And we have to go way, way back to find the first sparks of this, the audacity of the precursors, as it were.
We're talking mid-19th century. The source material points to this almost forgotten case from 1853 in the Colombian province of Vélez.
1853. That's decades before what we think of as the modern suffrage movements.
It is. It just shows that the idea of women participating in politics wasn't some foreign concept. It was there.
But I'm guessing it didn't last long.
Not at all. The Supreme Court revoked it almost immediately, arguing it violated the national order. But it's so instructive. The demand was there, but the state's first reaction was to enforce the patriarchal norm.
So fast forward a bit to the early 20th century, and these foundational movements start to come together.
Right. The first International Women's Congress in Buenos Aires in 1910 is a huge turning point. You have figures like Paulina Luisi from Uruguay, Julia Humanity in Argentina.
And they realized that just asking for legislative change could take forever.
So they got creative. The earliest successes came from finding a gap, a loophole in the system, and just driving a truck through it before the legislators could react.
Which brings us to the amazing case of Julieta Lanteri in Argentina in 1911. What was her big idea?
Well, Lanteri was a doctor, an activist, and she noticed something really crucial about the Argentine Constitution. It said who could vote, but it never explicitly said women couldn't.
Wow. So she used the silence of the law.
She did. She argued that since the law didn't forbid it, she, as a citizen, had the right. It was a genius move. She was basically forcing the state to prove she was legally incapable of voting.
And it worked.
It worked. On November 26, 1911, she became the first woman in South America to cast a vote in the municipal election. This wasn't a law passed by politicians. It was a right won in court by one woman.
That is an incredible story. But you can just feel the backlash coming.
It was immediate. The very next year, 1912, they passed a new electoral law.
And what did it do?
It closed that exact loophole. They linked electoral registration directly to military service.
Which was legally restricted to men, of course.
Of course. So it was a very deliberate, very sophisticated way of using existing patriarchal structures to block access. It was about class and gender power, plain and simple.
So that pattern is set early on. A brilliant woman finds a legal way in, the system panics, and they slam the door. And we see this again with the first official pioneer, Ecuador.
Yes, in 1924. Again, the story centers on one person, a doctor named Matilde Hidalgo de Procel.
Another doctor. That professional status must have been key to her confidence.
I think so. She had exceptional standing. And when she was denied registration to vote in Loga, she didn't make a political appeal, she made a legal one, just like Lanteri.
What was the argument this time?
She pointed to the 1906 Constitution. It only required 3 things to vote: citizenship, being over 21, and literacy.
And it didn't mention gender.
No mention of gender, so she challenged them, and the case went all the way up to the Council of State, and they unanimously ruled in her favor.
So Matilda Hidalgo votes in the legislative elections that year, the first woman in Latin America to vote in a national election.
Correct. And Ecuador made it official law 5 years later, in 1929.
Okay, this feels like a moment of real progress, but then we run headfirst into what you called the literacy trap.
And this is the critical piece of the puzzle. The right was granted, yes, but only to women who were literate.
And in the context of early 20th century Latin America, who did that exclude?
Well, that was the design. It systematically excluded millions. Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, poor rural women, basically anyone who hadn't had access to formal education.
So it wasn't an accidental loophole, it was voter suppression built on existing inequality.
Exactly. You don't need to explicitly ban them if the structure of society has already done it for you.
And how long did this go on in Ecuador?
The literacy requirements weren't fully eliminated until 1978, 1979.
50 years! For half a century, the right to vote was really only for a privileged few.
That's right. The promise of 1929 wasn't truly fulfilled for a very long time.
Now, what about Uruguay? Often seen as a progressive leader, they had a progressive constitution back in 1917.
They did, but their first vote was unusual. A tiny local plebiscite in a town called Cerro Chato in 1927. Because of a specific local decree, women were allowed to vote. It's a bit of a historical footnote, really.
And full suffrage was legalized in 1932, but women didn't actually vote in a national election until 1938. Why the 6-year gap?
It's a mix of political instability and just the slow process of updating all the electoral codes. But the most fascinating part involves Paulina Luisi, the great suffragist.
The same woman from the 1910 Congress?
The very same. She, the leading activist, actually told women not to vote in that 1938 election.
What? Why?
She was deeply concerned about the hard-right conservative political climate at the time. She felt that participating might just legitimize a government that didn't truly represent women's interests at all.
Wow. To fight for a right for so long and then to urge caution the moment it arrives, that says a lot about the political dangers at the time.
It does. It shows that for them, the vote was a tool. And if the whole machine was corrupt, maybe using the tool wasn't the right move.
We also see Brazil in 1932 and Cuba in 1934 get on board, but I'm guessing the literacy trap snaps shut in Brazil too.
With a vengeance. Brazil kept those literacy restrictions that excluded huge sections of the female population for an astonishingly long time.
How long?
Until 1985.
1985. That just completely reframes the whole timeline. The official date of suffrage is almost meaningless if most women can't actually use it.
Absolutely. The map of suffrage completion is deeply misleading if you don't look at the fine print.
Which brings us back to Argentina in 1947 and Eva Perón. This was different. This was a universal model.
It really was. And Evita's personal intervention was key. She literally went to the parliamentary debates, using her immense popularity to pressure the legislators. The law passed on September 9, 1947.
And the big difference, the thing that made it a benchmark, was the absence of restrictions.
That was the revolutionary part. No literacy tests. Any woman over 18 could vote.
The impact must have been immediate.
Massive. In the first presidential election in November 1951, over 3.5 million women voted. That was true universal suffrage from day one, and it set a new, much higher bar for the rest of the region.
So let's contrast that with Mexico. They had their own really energetic movement, right? Led by Elvia Carrillo Porto, the Red Nun of the Maya.
She was incredibly effective at the state level in Yucatan. She got women the right to run for office there in 1923. But the problem in Mexico was that everything was so fragmented.
And violent.
After her brother was assassinated in 1924, those early victories were just erased.
So despite that early energy, Mexico was actually quite late to the game.
Very late. They got the municipal vote in 1947, the same year Argentina got everything, but full national suffrage didn't arrive until 1953. It just shows how internal political chaos can stall progress for decades.
The rest of the map fills in gradually after that, but there are still some historical ironies left.
Oh, absolutely. Look at Colombia. We mentioned that super early precedent in 1853, but they didn't grant full suffrage until 1957.
And the way it happened was strange.
It was approved during the military dictatorship of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla.
A dictator grants women the vote.
It happens. Sometimes authoritarian regimes use popular social reforms to try and gain legitimacy or build a new base of support. And, ironically, that new voting bloc of women was critical in the plebiscite that eventually led to the end of that same dictatorship.
So the map is finally complete in 1961 when Paraguay becomes the last country.
Technically complete, yes, but we have to say it again. With the literacy restrictions in places like Brazil and Peru, true, universal suffrage for all women wasn't a reality until 1985.
And just as that's happening, the region plunges into the era of military dictatorships.
Right, and that freezes the democratic process for everyone. But it also forces women into new, crucial, non-electoral political roles.
Like the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, starting in 1977.
Exactly. They use their socially sacred identity as mothers to confront a brutal state when no one else could. They showed that political power isn't just about the ballot box. Sometimes it's born from pure resistance.
And that non-electoral power laid the groundwork for what came next. In Chile, for example, women's participation in the 1989 plebiscite was vital.
Hugely important. They were highly mobilized for the no vote that ended the Pinochet dictatorship. It just proved that women's power as a unified political force couldn't be suppressed.
So when democracy returns in the 80s and 90s, there's a new challenge. Suffrage is secure, but women are still almost completely excluded from elected office.
The gap between voting and ruling was massive, and it required a new, pretty radical solution.
The quota system.
The quota system. And Argentina, again, was the pioneer in 1991, passing a law that required 30% of legislative candidates to be women.
And what were the results of that?
The results have been substantial. The proportion of female legislators in the region went from about 9% in 1990 to around 25% by 2014, and some countries have pushed for full parity since then.
But the sources are clear that quotas have their limits. Getting women into Congress is one thing.
But getting them into real executive power is another. Women still hold less than a third of ministerial posts, less than a quarter of mayorships. And this is the modern version of the literacy trap. Indigenous and Afro-descendant women are still systematically excluded from those power structures.
So the battle for access just moves to a different, more guarded battleground.
Exactly. Though we have, of course, seen women reach the very highest office, it's important to distinguish between the first to assume the presidency, Isabel Perón in 1974, after her husband's death, and the first to be democratically elected.
Which was Violeta Barrios de Chamorro in Nicaragua in 1990.
Right, and she kicked off a wave. You had Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. The idea of a woman president is no longer unthinkable.
So looking at this whole story, what's the big takeaway? It seems to be a history defined by persistence and this constant struggle against restrictions.
It is, and the central contradiction is the powerful lesson. Latin America pioneered formal suffrage in some ways, yet it used things like the literacy trap to deny that right to millions of women until my lifetime. The law was just the starting line.
And the quota system is basically the ultimate admission that just saying everyone is equal isn't enough. You need active measures to correct for centuries of exclusion.
That's it, exactly. What stands out to me is that even now, a century after those first votes were cast, the fight for truly equitable representation, especially for Indigenous and Afro-descendant women, is still very much an incomplete project.
Which makes you wonder what other political struggles, even in so-called mature democracies, show that same painful gap between a law's promise and its full, meaningful implementation for everyone in society. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
Thank you.